Ready to lead like you've been doing it for years? The truth is, leadership is hard, but waiting to feel ready is harder. This is the Instant Leader podcast with Andy Lee, bringing you real stories and proven principles to lead with more confidence today.
In this episode, I sit down with Esther Kwan, a seasoned leader specializing in diversity, equity, and inclusion across public, private, and non-profit sectors. Esther shares her unique journey from Vancouver to the UK and the pivotal lessons she's learned in leading both high-pressure and collaborative environments. We dive deep into topics like psychological safety, the power of self-awareness, vulnerability in leadership, and learning from mistakes. Esther opens up about overcoming fear, embracing feedback, and her personal challenge navigating motherhood while staying true to her values. If you've ever wondered what makes an authentic and adaptive leader, or how to create teams where people thrive, this conversation is packed with candid insights you don't want to miss. Let's get inspired to lead with hope and not fear. Esther, hello. Welcome to the Instant Leader podcast. It's great to have you here. For the benefit of the people listening and watching, could you just give a little bit of a background, kind of highlighting your career, key moments in your life, and how you got to where you are right now?
Yeah, thanks for having me here today, Andy. Delighted to be here. A little bit about a pod history, if you will, of my background. I'm a transplant to the UK. I'm Chinese Canadian. I grew up in Vancouver majority of my life, was really interested in politics and government, and I entered pretty much a career in the civil service, both in Canada as well as here in the UK. Right now, I do specialize in diversity, equity, inclusion, and it's a passion of mine to support organizations to get to a stage of maturity around how they could be truly inclusive organizations that are able to capture the diversity of their staff and be able to better serve the communities that they're based in.
Thank you. And you're expecting?
I am expecting indeed. So if I am a little bit sort of, fuzzy, unclear, I blame it on the sort of like pregnancy itself and the lack of sleep.
Well, I just want to thank you for taking time out because you are pretty close to giving birth. So congratulations on that front. And yeah, again, appreciate your time here. You mentioned your current role there. Could you track back, because this is the public sector, but you weren't always working in that sector, and you've had experience in working in other sectors and other industries as well. In the context of your kind of developing leadership, could you give a bit of an insight into the path that you took?
Yeah. So even though I had spent majority of my career in the public sector, I did do a brief stint in the private sector as well as in the nonprofit sector, the third sector, if you will. Those particular experiences were quite formative to my journey as a leader, in that it exposed me to different sort of ways of working and different sort of ways of leadership styles, if you will. I think if you've been a career civil servant, there is almost a not to say that all senior civil servants are of a particular sort of type, but there is particular sort of competencies and ways of being that is expected of the senior leaders there. But what I found in operating in the nonprofit sector as well as in the private sector, there are different leadership qualities that you're able to, draw upon and observe, right? Dependent on the sort of organizational needs as well as the individuals that you've recruited into your team, right? Because ultimately, to be a good leader, you need to essentially be adaptive, right? And flexible to what your sort of organizational priorities are, as well as, different sort of ways and styles of working. So I've had the privilege to span my career across the various sectors to see, there are many different sort of personality styles, many different sort of team working styles, many different sort of leadership styles that I've been able to flex.
Great. Now, just to give our listeners and viewers a little bit more understanding, you were working for, and you don't have to name the actual company, but you're working for one of the big four previously in the private sector. Is that right?
Yeah, right.
And your role?
Yeah. So my role, I was in their sort of sustainability practice. And we had to essentially sort of build out an advisory service around sustainability services for clients. So that entails having to engage with external, sort of like your clients, right? In terms of pitching, various sort of like services that you might have, and obviously delivering the services and the projects for your clients. There's, the fun sort of bits around sort of business development. How do you really sort of, you know, develop a sort of compelling proposition, right? That is needed for the market. And so, I would have a team to essentially do business development with me. And ultimately, I think being in a Big Four, the sort of network is just so vast, and you do get to work across different service lines to, again, sort of understand how different individuals, right, are able to lead successfully under sort of immense pressure at times.
Yeah. And one word that comes to mind, and you can speak to this, is cutthroat. Is it like
Okay.
that? How much of it is like what's, because I really want to understand in that type of environment, which is very different to the public sector, you know, what leadership traits did you need to exhibit? What good and bad things did you observe with regards to lead?
Mm,
What did you learn?
mm. Yeah, it's a really good question, Andy. And I would actually sort of turn the question on its head because um, I think in any sector, there are different pressures, right? Um, And in the public sector, though, there may be a sort of perception that, oh, it's not as sort of like, cutthroat, or, it's in a different sort of way. And I think you have to operate knowing the context that you're in. So I'll give an example, right? So, when it comes to the urgency of ministerial briefings, that's a very common sort of like pressure that civil servants would have to go through. Um, and, sometimes you'll get called up by the minister's sort of office to say, I need like an urgent briefing in like an hour, right? So that's a level of pressure that might not necessarily exist in, say, for instance, the Big Four, where there's longer sort of lead time, when the sort of like, client deliverables are due. It's not necessarily sort of the client ringing up like, I need something in an hour now. Though there could be, the rare sort of occasions that could happen. I think it's just, again, knowing the sort of context that you're operating in, who your sort of stakeholders are, and being able to lead well through those particular sort of like, pressure points. As a leader, I think what I've developed and got to learn through, many sort of mistakes too, right? And times that I have failed is actually knowing your sort of own boundaries, as well as really sort of not letting the sort of pressure get to you, you know? Because I think, we are all very sort of emotional beings, right? We're human. And oftentimes we might not be our best selves when we are under pressure, right? That's when, um, we need to really sort of have that self awareness, as leaders to know, okay, how am I actually feeling in this moment right now? What is sort of like, upping my sort of anxiety? What are my sort of like the signs that I need to look out for in my sort of bodily response? Whether it's like, I sense that I am tensing up right now, why is that? Right? Is it because, this sort of like client sort of demand is putting pressure on me, and being able to have that self-awareness so that you're able, right, to respond not in a sort of reflexive manner, but actually be much more sort of proactive in managing, right, your sort of emotions and managing, your sort of response to that particular sort of circumstance and time. So where I've seen it done well, that's when leaders are self-aware, right? They know that, okay, this is a stressful situation. I'm aware that, my sort of like, heart rate is going up, but I'm going to like take a step aside, not respond, reflexively. I'm going to take some time away, calm myself down. And so that your sort of like nervous system is actually in a good position, right? To not act out of fear, right? But actually to act out of like a position of, you're in control of your emotions. and you know how you could actually relate to others, in your team, to your clients, to the minister in such a way that gets the best out of people, right? And when your sort of automatic nervous system, not going into sort of like too much into therapy, sort of talk, but when your sort of like automatic nervous system is at a stage where, it is like sort of like regulated and calm, right? Then you're able to essentially, be able to also empathize with others a lot better. And I think that's what makes a good leader, right? You are able to discern what your team actually needs in that sort of moment of crisis or in that moment of pressure, so that you could actually be the best leader to sort of say, hey, how could we actually get together, come collectively together and deal with a situation as a team, right? Instead of, my sort of default is actually to sort of just like, if I'm ever in a pressurized environment, or say I would go into sort of like a very sort of top down approach, but I know
Right.
that's not a sort of, an approach that works, all the time, right?
Yeah.
I'm not saying that top down approach isn't, um, necessary at times, but my sort of preferred way is to actually, let's have a discussion, let's co-create, let's sort of
Yeah.
solutionize together.
Great. And what do you mean exactly by top-down approach? I think I know what you mean, but I want you to clarify for us.
Of course, yeah. So when I say top down approach, I mean much more of a directive leadership
Right.
style,
Yep.
where it is more sort of like I'm telling you what
Yep.
to do instead of saying, what do you think we should do in this particular matter or instance?
Yeah, yeah, got it. Now, that's great. And I think you really highlighted the benefits of keeping calm under pressure, of having a self-awareness, of regulating your nervous system, so that you're not acting out of impulse, and you're acting more. You mentioned you're responding rather than reacting here. Um, were you always that way, Esther? I mean, you mentioned mistakes and failures. Like, were there some lessons that you learned along the way? So, where you kind of dropped the ball in cases or put your foot in it, like, or were you just born self-aware?
I wish we were all born self aware, but it is
Yes, that'd be
definitely a
great, right?
journey. No, I was not born self-aware, and I think I'm still a work in progress, right? There are so many instances that I could name for you, Andy, where I have not been self-aware and I have reacted out of, an instinctual sort of like gut response, and it didn't land particularly well, with my set of stakeholders. I'm trying to think of like a good sort of example for you right now. But say for instance, there were particular moments when I was, a civil servant where there was an urgent sort of deadline, right? Can't remember if it was like a ministerial briefing or some sort of briefing that I had to do. And I effectively sort of just said, everyone drop whatever you're doing right now. We're just going to like prioritize and do this, right? I thought that would have worked, in that particular sort of instance, right? To get that sort of like deliverable out the door immediately, because that's what the top is telling me, right? But what I understood is that it was such a pattern, that, it was every day, every other day that we were getting slammed with these particular sort of requests. And it was exhausting for the team, right? When you're in that sort of reactive mode of having to essentially sort of like pivot to something, people have different working styles, right? Some of my team members at the time, and I didn't fully appreciate it, they needed that sort of like, focus time, right? To really sort of get ahead on different sort of strategic priorities. The way in which I had essentially sort of just told everyone, no, we're just going to like focus, pivot to this urgently now, that was quite disruptive. Right. And it wasn't only until I was having my one-to-one with some of my team members, and they were brave enough to speak up at that time and said, Esther, I appreciate that there are a lot of these ministerial sort of demands, etc., but it's been really disruptive for, my sort of working pattern. I'm not able to kind of, think properly. I'm like much more stressed, right? And And that was like a bit of like a wake up for me, right? To sort of say, oh, actually, I can't just sort of be dictated necessarily by the demands from the top. To be an effective leader in that particular moment is actually to perhaps sort of push back. Right. To the sort of like, higher up management to say, look, is this really sort of urgent? Right. Do we need to do this, within the next hour, 2 hours? Could this actually wait? Right. And be as much stronger sort of advocate for my team. So that was a particular lesson for me. Right. And I think this is where, kind of maybe perhaps on a bit of a tangent, I think what makes a good leader is fostering that sort of psychological safety within teams. No, it's a bit of a buzzword right now, psychological safety. I truly do believe in it because what that means is when you have that sort of openness, right, within teams to raise concerns and to raise issues, right, then you're not sweeping things under the rug, right? You're able to identify the risks, the issues, head on instead of just pretending that everything is fine. And that's when, organizations are able to perform better, right? When you have that sort of psychological safety in teams. And that's what I really do try to focus in on in my sort of team building and the sort of ways in which I relate to my team and my colleagues across the board to sort of say, let's just have like an open, honest conversation, right? Instead of beating around the bush or, sort of sweeping things under the rug.
Esther, that's great. Yes, the psychological safety phrase, so important. Such a big term though, like similar to the word leadership. It just covers a multitude of things.
Mm,
Breaking it down here, this was about the lesson that you learned. And I picked out two things from there. One, you got feedback that helped you
mm-hmm,
become more aware of your own leadership style.
mm-hmm.
As a result of that feedback, two, you then realized that I don't say needed to, maybe you were already doing that, but in this situation, protect and look after your team, almost like a filter. When you're getting orders from above, you're applying a filter now, a certain kind of discernment, like, how will this impact the team that you're managing? Whereas before it sounded like when you got the memo, you pass it straight down to the rest of your team
That's
as
right.
you received it.
Yeah.
That is that accurate there?
Yeah, that's right.
So then with the feedback piece, which really helped you to realize,
Mm.
you said your team members were brave enough to do that. Have you changed the way that you might elicit feedback now, realizing that it could be valuable and there are other things that you might be missing and are in your blind spots?
Yeah. And I think the civil service in general, when it comes to how uh, you get feedback and the sort of expectations that are built into, leadership competencies and behaviors, it's quite common for individuals to ask for 360 feedback and in such a way that is anonymized. I think that's quite a powerful sort of tool. So I have used in the past sort of just like even when in different organizations they might not have the HR systems to collect that 360 feedback, it's really easy to essentially create like a Microsoft Forms or a Google Forms, right? And you could essentially ping it around to various sort of individuals and asking individuals, right, for honest sort of assessment and feedback on your particular leadership style. And I think that is very important um, for your own sort of self awareness and development, right? And it also
Yeah.
gives people the license to, give you that sort of feedback in an anonymous manner. Some
Yes.
people might be afraid to attach their name to, the piece of feedback, right? And by giving them an anonymized sort of like form, then, you're able to elicit that sort of like more honest, deeper sort of like feedback from individuals.
Yes. So that brings up an interesting point, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into this 360
Mm,
feedback. I've
yeah.
come across it. I've worked with it, like in organizations that I've worked with. We, helped implement it. A couple of things here. One is, well, it's anonymized, and I question. I've asked questions about the fact that it's anonymized because if someone
Mm,
has to feel if the only way they could give feedback is if they knew that they weren't going to get found out or identified that it was them, what does that say about the current culture?
Yes.
And then second, what if it's a small team? And even if it is anonymized, you're reading the comments, you're like, I know exactly who that is. And the
Yeah.
person filling it in might be thinking, they're going to know that this was me writing this. So then they're probably going to, if they're scared of any retribution, they're probably going to water down their comments, and you're, again, not going to
Yeah.
get the honest feedback there.
Yeah. No, absolutely, Andy, right? I think those points are very valid when it comes to, and it's again speaks to the sort of like, culture, the psychological safety that is or isn't present within your team as well as a wider organization, right? So even though 360 sort of it's a very useful tool, it obviously is situated within the cultural norms, right? And behaviors and practices of that organization. So it's not that I'm leaning just on the 360 feedback for, having that sort of like, self-awareness and making sure that, I am covering all bases. I think ultimately it is down to your relationships, right? With individuals and the sort of environment that you're fostering, within your team as well as within the wider sort of organization. Um, which is why I think it's, the sort of softer things, right? Quote unquote softer things that, teams might do, such as, check-ins, on a weekly basis. And it's not just like, going straight to the sort of like, tasks on hand, the sort of like, I think we've lost that somewhat, during the sort of like, post-pandemic era where you don't I've even found myself, right? You go for less coffees, you go for less sort of like lunches with your colleagues. But that was actually a very important part of that glue, right? To the relationships that you have with your team. To actually know the person, right, as an individual, and not just treating it as some sort of like, oh, this is just a very sort of like professional sort of like, interaction that I'm having with you, but getting to know each individual as a person. And that's what I really try to prioritize and have that sort of like set time within my week, despite the sort of, the calendars, sort of like diary arrangements, etc. We're always feeling that, oh no, like we have another sort of like immediate appointment, but having the protected time where you could actually have a conversation that is not about work
Mm,
with your colleagues, I think that is quite important. But you got to balance it out, right? Because I think,
mm,
in the sort of like big four, there is a tendency to, have quite sort of like intense expectations sometimes around sort of after work social engagements. But this is where you need to be, again, self-aware of how much capacity and bandwidth do you have, right? And why are you showing up in these particular sort of spaces? Sometimes people do feel pressured to go to these particular work events just to, show their face or, making sure that they're considered for promotions, etc. There's a lot of motives there. But if you're
mm.
going in it with, I guess, like the intention of sort of seeing your colleagues as, people, right? People that, you're working with, that's from my own sort of Christian background, like, people that I'm called to love, right? Then, that could give you that extra sort of, I guess, like motivation and energy to, um, yeah, be in a community with others.
Yeah, no, that's great, Esther. So your responsibility as a team leader to look after your team, and I think, as you mentioned, to recognize how well you're implementing psychological safety for your team. How do you know if you are? Like, how do you measure that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think dependent on who you ask, there's a lot of researchers that study psychological safety exclusively, um, which I'm not going to take away from their sort of like research and work. Um, it depends how I would gauge it in a very non-scientific manner, because I'm not going to carry out like a research study on my team. But in essence, it's if they are able to raise issues or risks, right, with you um, in a timely sort of manner. And if they feel comfortable to do so, right? And if they feel that they could speak up about the ideas that they have, not only just around risks or issues, but actually any ideas for, say, for instance, developing a new strategy, or how should we engage with these particular sort of stakeholders? So it's not just you as the sort of manager or the leader of the team, dictating what needs to happen. These are the sort of sequence of events that we need to do, but actually it's truly about bringing on board your entire team, right, to co-create the sort of solution together, and everyone feels invested, right, in that particular sort of solution.
Yeah. Well, have you had situations where um, you think you're doing it, but you're actually not? Like, what if
Mm.
because you're asking somebody, I don't know if you have, you could ask them, are you comfortable sharing your thoughts with me? And they're like, yeah. Like, do you think this is a good idea? Yep. Do you have any questions? No. And then the meeting is dismissed, and then they have little meetings after the meetings, kind of thing, and
Hmm.
chat in the corridor. Like, eh, I guess you need to have a sensitivity to really pay attention to what's going on in the person. Like,
Yes.
if they're congruent with their words and their
Yes.
actions.
Absolutely. And I would say that it is definitely a particular um, challenge that I have faced throughout my career, especially I would say in the civil service. Um, I think as a North American, uh, we tend to be quite blunt in general. We don't necessarily, beat around the bush as much, I would say. Broad
Right.
generalization
You're
here.
Canadian, right?
Yeah, Canadian. Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Um, and the ways in which we might present particular sort of ideas. And I see this with my husband too. He's British, right? And the ways in which we communicate is very different at times, right? He'll say, Esther, uh, I quite like, how does he phrase this? He would have a particular preference for something, but he wouldn't say that is his preference. He will say, would you like to do this thing? Right. And then I will give my honest sort of, answer to that question, which is, no, I don't want to do that. Because you're asking me a question, right? So I took it on sort of like face value. But the way in which he was trying to, and this is through sort of like, obviously a lot of conversations I've had with him in the past, right? I'll pick up on the fact that's like, oh, he seems a little bit upset, but I don't know if he is upset by the way in which, I responded to that, right? So I found out eventually that it was because he actually wants, right, to do that thing that he's asking me, you know? And so even that sort of like, way in which we interpret, questions, how we interpret words, etc. There is that sort of cultural
Yeah,
sort of
absolutely.
nuance, right? So I'm still on that learning journey. Definitely there have been blunders, right? Where exactly as you've described it, Andy, I haven't been able to sort of like pick up on the fact that people were actually saying, one thing, but they absolutely meant the other thing, right? But this is where I will try to address it like, head on, and say, sorry, I misunderstood you. I genuinely thought that you meant X, right?
Because that's what they
This is
said.
yeah, because this is what you've said. And, but let's get under the skin of stuff, right? If you think differently, I'm very happy and, open to have that conversation to really get to the heart of what is actually bothering you. That's the way in which, I think being a North American operating in a quite a British sort of like context, I'm very upfront. I address it head on to say, there are cultural differences. I'm sorry if like, I am going to misinterpret some of the things that you say and you do, but that's because, I come from a very different culture to, you, and I'm always sort of learning, even with my own husband, right? But just being upfront about that, right? Name the sort of, the sort of challenge or the sort of ways in which, I'm actually not perfect, right, in reading British culture, but please help me. And I think that's again going on a bit of a tangent. To be a leader is actually to sort of say, please help, right, me in addressing a particular sort of issue that I, need sort of like, development in. Is not being afraid to really sort of address it head on.
Yeah. And yeah, you picked up on something there, like, or I picked up on what you're saying, that openness, that that vulnerability to say, hey, I need help, is huge. Like to gain that trust, right? Because I think sometimes leaders fall into that trap of, well, positionally, I need to know the answers. Positionally, I need to show myself as being mentally or emotionally stronger than you. I need to be more certain in uncertain
Hmm.
situations. And that kind of pressure can force a leader to start compromising, right?
Hmm.
And taking charge inadvertently can create distance between them and the team that they're leading because of what
Yeah.
you just said. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think like for leaders that I've observed, right, and which I would like to model my leadership style after, are the ones who are vulnerable, right, about their particular sort of shortcomings, those who will essentially sort of say, how I've handled this particular situation wasn't particularly well, and I'm sorry, right? That, we've been so um sort of trained to think that addressing any sort of vulnerabilities or naming vulnerabilities is a weakness. But in fact, once you get over that sort of mental hurdle of saying, actually, this is going to grow me. As a person, and where does that sort of like, it has to do with sort of like, being self aware, right? It's like, why am I feeling that I can't show my weakness? It's again coming out of fear, right? It's coming out of shame. Maybe there were instances in the past where I felt been made to feel stupid, right? Or made to feel ashamed about naming these particular weaknesses. But once we're able to actually sort of like confront our sort of fears, right? The sense of shame that we have felt in the past and sort of say, well, you know what? Actually, being able to rise above that, right? And again, not acting out of the sort of past experiences of shame, of, fear, that actually releases us to, you know, be a lot more, well, that releases us to actually have that sort of professional growth, that is needed in the
Yeah.
workplace.
Yeah. Love that. I really want to talk. Let's talk about this part because I was going to go back to something else, but the shame, not acting out of shame.
Mm.
How do you do that?
A lot of therapy, Andy.
Therapy, that's the answer.
Genuinely, because, I think we are all very different in terms of where shame comes from, right? You know, uh, Being a Chinese Canadian, growing up in the Chinese culture, I had understood shame in a particular way, in terms of that whole sort of building that facade of competence. You would never, ever, bring shame upon your family, right? And that sort of performative, facade, I had to really sort of contend with throughout my professional career because that was what I had grown up with in the sort of like family and the sort of community, Chinese community that I was in. And I had to unlearn a lot of these really unhelpful ways, frankly, right? Of recognizing that my worth is not built upon whatever sort of external facade or presentation, right? That, I'm exhibiting, but actually my worth, and this is where, again, therapy and also like my faith comes in to really sort of understand that truly, my worth is not built on what I achieve, right? But genuinely just by being me, right?
And,
But that takes a lot of unpicking, with my therapists as well as, with my sort of like community to really sort of just like gain that sense of confidence, right? In who I am and being able to unpick and unpack all the sort of unhelpful thought patterns, right? All the sort of voices in your head. Why is it that I can't sort of say for instance admit weakness, right,
mm,
in front of my team members? Where is that coming from? Is it
mm,
because it came from all the sort of like years of being inculcated in an environment where you just have to be that A plus student, you have to just like, perform, 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 right? At the sort of highest levels. And,
mm,
is that truly what I want? Right.
mm,
And think about my sort of pregnancy, how I was parented and, how I would like to parent my child, it's brought up a lot of these particular sort of, conversations within me and time for self reflection too, right? To sort of say, how, would I want to foster that sort of like, nurturing environment for my baby, right? So that they're not, essentially sort of just like expected to perform. And that
Mhm.
is how they seek validation, right?
Yeah.
From those in positions of authority and power.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you're going to be a wonderful mum based on what you
It's going to be a learning journey.
but you're on it. You're on it. And that's the great thing.
Yeah.
I want to track back and change perspectives here. We talked about being vulnerable or creating an environment where your team feels safe and that they can come to you honestly. What about if you've ever been in a position where you're reporting to, so you're having to lead up?
Mm.
What effect can you have on the, a psychological safety of the environment when you're not necessarily the one controlling the temperature? Like how can you do it from your position?
Yeah. I think that's a great question, Andy. I think it's pretty much the same principles, but obviously with a bit more nuance, right? Because if you're trying to manage upwards, if you will, there are sensitivities there. But again, I think this is where the relational aspect is really important. How, what exactly would you like to get out of the conversations and the interactions that you would have with your superiors, right? In the organization, going into those particular conversations with a particular objective or agenda in mind. Let me give you an example. So I had a particularly challenging relationship with, I'm not going to name the organization. I had a particular challenging relationship with this particular boss of mine. And she was doing things that put a lot of pressure on the team. And I didn't appreciate some of the ways in which she was going about her set of behaviors and interacting with myself and the team. It made us feel, more stressed out than we needed to be. But it all came to a head where I realized I needed to really just address, right, the sort of dynamics in which she was interacting with myself and the rest of the team. And so being in that conversation, I knew what my objectives were. I knew that I needed to first be emotionally calm, right? To be in that conversation because it can't, if it ever gets sort of like heated, then, you don't want the individual to be on the defensive, right? So I needed to be in that sort of self-aware state of, okay, I'm going to be entering that conversation, not sort of angry. I'm going to be calm, right? When I enter into that conversation, one. Two, prepare exactly what I'm going to say. What are the points that I want to land? Right in that conversation, because as a general rule of thumb, especially if you're talking to sort of like senior execs, etc., you don't want to waste your time. You want to like land your points clearly, concisely, right? So I prepared mentally, right, for that conversation. I sometimes use this sort of like, I'll not sort of like speaking, but in essence, practice that conversation, right, in my head to sort of say, okay, this is how I'm going to like phrase, this particular point in such a way that would not lead to a defensive response from her, right? Um, Oftentimes that might also be a little bit, you have to be vulnerable in that particular situation, right? To sort of say, I feel X, right? In this way. But again, again, through my sort of like therapy, having that sense of, starting with like, I feel, not saying you did this, right? In an
Mm.
accusatory sort of like manner is the way to go, right? In your interactions, but sort of say, I feel X in this particular situation when, this happened, right? Then that creates that sense of, hopefully that empathy, right? That sort of connection that you want from your senior leader. And so going into that conversation, practicing what exactly are the points you want to land. You want to be vulnerable, right? To share how you're feeling about the situation. And I had that conversation. I was quite nervous, admittedly, going into that conversation because I didn't know how she was going to react. And there was a culture in that organization where people are not that vulnerable to begin with. So I didn't know how that was going to be taken by her. And she's been in the organization for ages. So she's been a bit of a lifer, right? So I wouldn't expect her to immediately change her, sort of ways of interacting, etc. But that's actually another important point, I would say, um, sort of set your expectations, right?
Mm.
Know that it's not going to be potentially just one conversation. It could be, but for people's behaviors to change, it takes time, right? You know, just looking at ourselves, how often are we able to sort of like break particular habits of behavior, right? Or thought patterns, it takes time, concerted effort. So set your expectations realistically. So I went into the conversation, haven't done that. And it was just such a great sort of lifting of, pressure and burden. I'm so glad that I had that conversation with her because it ended up with, it turned into, it was originally scheduled to be like a 30-minute sort of like meeting. It turned into a 4-hour conversation,
Oh, wow.
right? Yeah, it opened essentially, she said, Esther, no one's ever given me this sort of like feedback before. And I thank you for opening my eyes to the ways in which, some of my years, how it's actually landing. Right. And at the end of the day, she actually asked me to be her reverse mentor.
Oh, wow.
So, that was a fantastic sort of outcome. Right. But again, I think it's, I would hope for all my interactions with my superiors to land that way, but it's not a guarantee. But all you could do, right, is to try, to sort of manage your relationship with your superiors in such a way that increases that vulnerability within the team, right? Um, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. What a fantastic outcome that was. Credit to you.
Hmm.
So, the preparation, going in with a plan, not trying to wing it,
Yeah.
having self-awareness, that all helped, right, to contribute to the eventual outcome there.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's really good. And then, of course, then you've taken that, and then when you sit in kind of the equivalent of her seat, it gives you that information as well, and that insight in terms of how you want to lead your team and what things to look out for and what things you might not be seeing. Is that right?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, Esther, changing track a little bit. What's the biggest leadership challenge that you'd say you're currently facing?
Oh, that's a really big question, Andy. The biggest leadership challenge that I'm facing personally, I think it's going to be very specific to, my current experience, which is, having a baby.
Yeah.
I think being able to, again, sort of enter a new season of life into a bit of an unknown, but able to navigate through that sort of known in such a way that stays true to myself and not being dictated by what society is, telling us we should be doing in this season of life. To speak in a not so cryptic sort of manner, I think there's a lot of pressure on women, right? To essentially, be a working mom and, you know, do it all basically, right? And not being influenced by that dominant cultural narrative, right? Of how I should be showing up to work, how I should be showing up to my family, and knowing what my sort of personal values are and what I prioritize. I think that's the biggest sort of leadership challenge, right? In going into, because I don't want to necessarily throw myself into particular sort of projects or particular sort of like things without really examining, what is my actual sort of motive. So, not necessarily like a leadership challenge, but it impacts on it, right? It's all about, again, that sort of self awareness and being able to navigate how I am going to um, show up, right, in this next sort of like season of my life. I think that's
Yeah.
going to be the next challenge. And I, personally, as a Myers Briggs, I don't know if your listeners are, Myers Briggs sort of followers. It's one way of gauging sort of like, your particular personalities, etc., your sort of preferences. I'm an ENFJ, right? Um, but what I've known that it's Myers-Briggs is not fixed either, right? You could definitely sort of change between, J or like a P. I've definitely felt, right, that my tendencies or preference to sort of plan is definitely the thing that is giving me rise to the sort of anxiety that I might have in that next season because there are so many unknowns, right? With the baby, how much energy levels I'll have, right? That's what's giving me anxiety. But then when I really sort of sit back and reflect, why am I being anxious about this? Right? In the first place. It's because, again, there are the sort of things that I've been trying to unpick, right? Throughout the sort of like, my upbringing, my childhood, culture, society, of again that sort of like, oh, I just need to be perfect. I need to sort of just like nail everything that I do because my worth is placed on how
Mm,
I am able to nail everything in my life, right? But actually it's like, okay, no, I don't need to nail everything in my life, right? It is okay to make mistakes.
mm,
I did not die when I like made
no.
this particular mistake or I had that sort of like fumble. And so it's all that sort of like constant reminder, and being able to navigate, yeah, the next sort of like, few years with that sense of, assuredness and groundedness in who I am.
Yeah. And that's an ongoing journey, isn't it? I mean, you've mentioned that
Mm,
you've done a lot of work in the past and you've had this time now during your maternity leave to reflect and think and have that space. Um, and it sounds like you're going to continue, post baby, it will continue to be a journey. Like it doesn't
absolutely.
end.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the other thing you were mentioning there was just being okay to make mistakes. Kind of John
Mm.
Maxwell talks about it. I think he has a book called Failing Forward or Fail Forward, Stumble Forward. And that is that part of being a good leader, like being
Mm.
okay to make mistakes or making mistakes. Like it sounds like it's unavoidable, right?
Absolutely. Right. I think, anyone who tells you that they're perfect is going to be lying about, like you need to make mistakes, right? In order to learn and grow. We didn't come out of the womb knowing how to, walk immediately, know how to read like, Jane Austen. We made a lot of mistakes along the way in order to be the person that we're now. And I think it is about, again, that sort of vulnerability of saying, like, you know what? Like, this person didn't get from like, A to B, right? Just magically. It's like a very winding sort of path,
Yeah.
right? That would have necessitated a lot of mistakes. I remember when I was an undergrad. And, again, when people are not in that sort of stage of maturity to know, like, especially when you're in a very pressurized environment and you think that, oh, everyone's doing so much better because they landed this internship or that internship or, this job or that law school, etc. And you don't see behind the curtains, right? In terms of just how many rejections people have had, right? I recall telling one of my mentees recently that, it's like, she was saying, oh, how did you get to the position that I was like, through a lot of rejections, actually, you know, like I didn't land all these particular sort of jobs, by just submitting one sort of application. I submitted hundreds before I actually, got to the place that I am, thousands throughout my lifetime, probably.
Um,
Right. And so it's to sort of see, you know, throughout all the sort of areas, right, of my life, whether it's like my personal relationships, whether it's, my career, it's all about learning, right? What could I have done differently, right? To garner a different sort of outcome next time. And using those particular sort of moments of failure, right, as actually, I mean, it's so cliche, right, but as, sort of like learning opportunities. So say for instance, whenever I have a job interview, right, even if I get like a rejection, right, from, I always ask for feedback. I was like, okay, thanks so much for taking the time, right, to speak with me. I was really interested in the job, but I'm glad that you're able to find another person who's more suitable, but I would really love to learn, how could I have improved, right? Upon, the interview itself, what were some of the areas which you think I should develop in a bit more if I want to enter this particular sector, if I want to land this particular sort of job. So having that sort of openness, right, to hear from others, I think it's really important for your sort of personal, professional development.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely agree with that. Now, mistakes, they are an inevitable part of your journey and growth as a leader, right? That's clear. And they're unavoidable because nobody's perfect. And we can interpret them as learning opportunities, after the event when we have a time to look back and evaluate.
Mm,
But mistakes aren't all created equal, right? You've got small
yes, that is.
ones, big ones.
Yeah.
Well, so how do, I don't know if you've got experience of this, decide what level of risk you could take with something that could end up being wrong that might cost you your job? At the
Mm,
extreme end of things.
hmm. Yeah. That's a really good question. Yeah, as you said, I think like all all decisions, right, are not equal in terms of the impact that it has on the organization, on people, etc. I think this is where your risk appetite comes in and what exactly is the objective, right, for the decision that you're going to take. Um, I'm trying to think through if there was a particular mistake or a decision that I had taken that have costed me my job. I haven't been in that position just yet, um, but knowing that the it's for how I would go about every sort of decision that I make. I'm quite a sort of methodical sort of like decision maker. I'm not necessarily led by my emotions as much. Whenever there is a particular sort of, critical decision I need to make, I like to gather all the facts first and weigh the sort of pros and cons, right? Of the decisions that I'm going to make, as well as the impacts, right? The potential implications and the blowback. And dependence on where I am at in my career at the time, right? And the decision that I'm going to take, right? I'll weigh the risks accordingly and sort of say, well, do I really want to go out on a limb, right? And broach this particular sort of subject with the sort of like chief exec, right? When I know it could be like a 50-50 chance that he might hate it or he might love it, etc. Um, we're quite limited though, in terms of how we perceive others' sort of objectives, their particular sort of drivers, etc. And this is again something that I'm continually trying to sort of like, develop in terms of being able to gauge what exactly are the sort of sticking points, right? For the individual that I have at the opposite end of the table. Um, but at the end of the day, you just have to live with like, the consequences, right? And if you think at that moment in time that it is, preferable to kind of put your bets on. Actually, I do have an example. Um, the, in this particular organization, there were different sorts of sort of services that we could provide. Okay, and I was gunning for this particular sort of service that we should go for. But it was going to essentially take up a lot of my team's time. It was going to take up a lot of my time to really sort of develop. It turns out that there wasn't going to be any sort of investment on the part of the organization to go down this particular sort of path. So that costed me almost sort of, I would say, like, 5 months to better part of the half a year, to go down this sort of like, heavy sort of investment route for it to not have that sort of co-investment from the organization to develop out this particular sort of service. Obviously, it costed me, 5-6 months of my time as well as my team's time, right? It wasn't unsalvageable, but it wasn't the sort of outcome that I had wanted, nor the outcome that my, bosses had wanted either, right? But that didn't cost me a job, luckily, but it did make me sort of reflect, right? To sort of say, well, how could we actually sort of like, gauge the organizational sort of appetite for this better next time, and maybe do that sort of like gauging up front instead of sinking in sort of like 5 6 months, right, into something that was not going to be viable, you know.
Yeah.
But again, that was probably the most costly sort of decision that I had taken in terms of time and effort, right? Um, but at the end of the day, next time around, again, you can sort of like build on that experience and say, well, do you know what? Actually, let's sort of like really sort of scrutinize that sort of investment up front first, before sinking in all that time.
Yeah. Yeah. So was it a lack of communication at the beginning? Was it a lack of just asking the questions initially that
I
led to
think
that?
there were quite a number of factors at play in that particular scenario. There wasn't clear communication on the part of the organization writ large to sort of say, everyone, and this is maybe again something to do with, I still haven't gotten to the bottom of it, if it was actually sort of like a cultural sort of difference or if it was a sort of just, people tend to not want to sort of say no to things, right? And that's where I would highly recommend, your listeners to a book called Quit by Annie Duke. Don't know if you've heard of it, Andy, before.
I haven't.
It's a great book. It talks about the psychology of quitting, because I think part of like the decision making process as a leader is not just to say sort of like yes, but it's actually to sort of, when do you pull the plug on something, you know?
Mm.
And there is all, the book talks about all the very sort of like cognitive bias or the psychology behind why it's sometimes so hard to quit, right? Whether it's like quitting a job that you're very unsatisfied with, whether it's like quitting a relationship, all aspects of life, right? Annie Duke comes from a poker playing background. So she
Uh,
knows that actually, quitting at the right time is actually the best thing that you could do as a poker player.
yeah,
Um, but in
that's
effect, it's
great.
like, yeah, humans, we have this loss aversion and
Yes.
we don't want to lose, right?
Yes,
On things. And that's why,
absolutely.
sunk cost fallacy, all that sort of stuff. But all to say, yeah, I think being a great leader is also knowing when to quit.
Yeah, I love that. And that's exactly what was going through my mind, sunk cost bias as well. People think they've invested so much into something, they have to see
Yeah.
it through to the end. Whereas actually, if you pull out, then you're kind of cutting your losses, and you think, okay, that just treat that as a learning experience and move on. But no, our tendency is to kind of just dig deeper and deeper and deeper. Great. So
Yeah.
the book was called "Quit" by
Annie Duke.
Annie Duke. Great recommendation. Thank you, Esther. All right, moving on to the last couple of things here, and this has been a great conversation, by the way. Thank you so much for your openness and sharing your experience. Um,
Of course.
what advice would you give to aspiring leaders?
Don't underestimate what you could bring to the table. Everyone can be a leader. We all lead in different ways, and there's no one set way to lead, right? It's always about finding your sort of authentic voice and self in terms of how you want to lead as an individual and what sort of impact you want to make ultimately through your leadership.
Yeah, love that. Find your authentic voice. Know what you want to impact.
Hmm.
And on your personal journey, I mean, you have mentioned therapy, so I'll take that as one of the answers here. How else did you go about finding that authentic voice, or would you say you're still finding it? And then so there's the second thing there was like knowing what you want to impact, which is kind of like your
Hmm.
or your driving motivation. How does
Yeah.
somebody begin to nurture that?
Mm. I think I've always been quite honest with myself in terms of what impact I want to make um in the world. Maybe that's a function of my personal faith,
Mm,
in knowing that, I have a limited time on this earth and I want to use all the various skills and experiences that I've been given to impact on the world around me in a positive way. And so I guess it's in some ways the fact that I landed in the diversity, equity, inclusion space It's very much aligned to my own personal beliefs from a faith perspective. And that has helped me to really sort of narrow in on the why, right? In terms of why I get up every day, why I, engage in particular conversations and relationships, and why I go and show up to work, doing the work that I do. There's that strong sort of driver within me. And that has been, yeah, for the past sort of decade or so, I think that has been that sort of constant driver, motivator behind everything that I do. So that's been very clear from the outset.
Yeah, Esther, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your time with me here on this episode. One last thing I wanted to ask is if the viewers and the listeners could just take one thing away from our conversation today, what would that be for you?
Um, don't be driven by fear, but instead lead with hope. That would be the one thing that's I would leave with your listeners today.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Esther, and all the best with the little new addition to the family in the imminent future. Wishing you all the best, and thank you again for your time.
No worries. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to The Instant Leader. If this episode helped, please follow the show and leave a quick review. It really helps others find us. For practical resources and to join the community, head to theinstantleader.com. I'm Andy Lee. See you next time.